This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show today. Today we're going to be talking about board education, and I sort of feel like I have one of the experts joining me in this space. We like to get together and sort of talk about this thought leadership kind of stuff, so I think it's going to be an interesting segment today. So join me in welcoming Dan Siciliano, who's the professor and faculty director for the Arthur and Tony Remby Rock Center for Corporate Governance. In addition, he is the associate dean for executive education and specialty programs, Stanford Law School. In addition to that, he is the co-director of Stanford's infamous Directors College, which is certainly one of the premier events that directors can attend for board education. And Dan, I'm not going to stop there, because you are, in addition to those things, you're a board member, you're a CEO, you're an entrepreneur, okay? So maybe let's just take a second sort of summarize those experiences for the audience, just so they can see the vastness from whence you come.
Yeah, my mom describes that as me being accomplished. My wife says I can't decide what job I actually want. So obviously I spend most of my time at Stanford and enjoy running the Center for Corporate Governance and working with people there, but I come at it from a slightly different angle, in part because I started in the private sector, launched a software company, grew it. We recently sold it to PNC, their private equity arm, and I'm executive chair of that, and at the moment interim CEO. Exciting stuff. It's a new phase for me to be on the board of and running a private equity owned company after having run it for a long time, kind of just with me. We had a board, but ironically I think we followed pretty good governance, but you know, I was in charge. So it's been a good experience. So I come at it from a different view. I definitely empathize to a large extent with sitting board members and certainly CEOs and management teams that have to get stuff done. Business is hard, and I think that's one of the big points that we need to keep in mind with corporate governance. Corporate governance is not the means to business success. It is part of helping business success, but business is hard. And that kind of trumps, in a lot of ways, a lot of the things that we think will solve things on the corporate governance side.
Well, and one of the things that I wanted to pick your brain on is just this whole board education. I don't want it to appear self-serving for either of us, right, having been in the business, but it's a very important part of the process. And the first thing I want to ask you is, when you and I sort of started in this business, there wasn't a whole lot of talk about corporate governance, okay? And then we saw the Enron stuff hit, then we saw Sarbanes-Oxley hit, then we saw stock option backdating, then we saw recently Dodd-Frank. We've seen the SEC, step in with their regs. So, and now we're having proxy advisory and activism pressure. So there's been no sort of let up since it started to become popular. But talk to me and the audience a little about what your impression is of board education today, not only sort of how it's being provided, but what's the attitude of the directors towards board education today?
Sure. So I think that you're absolutely right, that the pressure on corporate governance, the issues that are confronting boards is not diminishing, it's increasing, and so I think board education is more important than ever. There's also a little side note to that, which is, on average, board members serve on fewer boards. So there's less opportunity to interact with a variety of boards and get exposure to experience. There is still a strong preference, maybe even increasing, for sitting executives to serve on boards, but they tend to be limited maybe to one board. So the cross-pollinization that we used to see, which was its own form of education, has really gone away. Maybe for the good, because it allows for other opportunities. that means that board education is more important than ever. And I think there is a subset of directors who very much embrace it. And there's a lot of boards who bring custom education to their boardroom. But it seems like the majority of directors, probably because they're busy, they are very savvy, have some experience, tend not to find the time to become involved in a formal director education. And I actually think this is potentially a big mistake because they underestimate the opportunity that's presented by interacting with other directors. So meeting other directors who are not on your board is a great chance to compare notes, understand different perspectives. The other part that I think has changed in the last 10 years, and I'm curious if you feel this way, but I think corporate governance has gone from an area that had a lot of anecdotes, a little bit of science, and a lot of thoughts, but it has become something that has a lot of empirical work, that has a lot of heavy-duty research, now backing up and sometimes debunking some parts of what we took for granted in corporate governance. And that's an opportunity for board members to come and hear, really exactly how many boards do a particular strategy around succession. Did those boards do better in performing on stock price later? We now have data and information about that, which didn't even exist 5 years ago. So the chances of learning really actionable information as a board member at these director education events, I think is much improved over the last decade.
Well, there's no question about what's available and what's improved. We just participated in a panel, talking about everything from cyber risk to CEO succession, and but it is interesting. I appear to see a lot of the same faces. I mean, a lot of the people that know that this education is helpful to me to be the most effective director that I can be. I still run into a lot of people that say either that they don't have time or that the course of they sit on their existing board and they sort of feel like the combination of that and the board I sit on is enough to do that. I do know one of the things that definitely has happened internally, corporate secretaries and managements have gotten 100 times better at doing custom education or doing internal training. So that certainly has helped, and we can't minimize how that's happened. But it's funny, when we did, we've been obviously doing programs for a long time. Our premier event is the annual Boardroom Summit. We started the peer exchange hoping that would help keep people for the summit. It turned into the most valuable program that we have. And somebody says, I never thought that 6 hours could go so quickly. They literally spend that much time with their audit committee peers or their comp committee peers, all just throwing out things. So when you look at when you turn to a person and somebody says, I don't need that outside interaction, it's hard to not view them as a little short-sighted in all that's happening. I mean, there's just too much change. I just had Judge Chandler in here, and he blew me away just on the legal aspects of that.
Well, and I think, one of the challenges is that people perceive of director education as this classroom environment, maybe someone lecturing about the law of corporate governance. And I don't know if it was ever that. Certainly it wasn't that at Stanford or Directors College, and I know it isn't that at any of your events. But instead, I think it has become exactly as you described, a sort of facilitated interaction between directors in management, sometimes directors and regulators, directors and you name it, the insurers who provide their D&O insurance, the comp consultants who they might or might not hire, all the players in the ecosystem of corporate governance. I think it's a little bit on us to get through to those directors who are reticent and maybe have this old style in their head. And one way I found is to pose the simple question, what is it that keeps you up at night as a director? And everyone has an answer to that. And then you can follow up and say, well, would you like to talk to other directors who have either figured that out or talk with them in front of other people who you can turn to and ask follow-up detailed questions? And everyone I've talked to says, well, yeah, no, that I would do. I could find time to do that. And I think that's the trick, is for us to help directors who are very busy, right? They're all so busy, realize that this is an opportunity for them to sleep better, right? To get answers to the questions that have been bugging them sometimes for years.
Well, that's a great point. And I'm always happy when you and I get to sit down, because I don't think I have a guest that I can pose the most thought-provoking questions to that I know will create banter with me more than you. So here we go, okay? Right. Here's your question for the day. When you look at all that's happened with shareholder engagement, ISS, and the tenure and the independence issue, all the activism that's happening where they're second guessing everything that's happened. My simple question to you is, if a company is performing well and returning to shareholders, shouldn't they have the opportunity to buy a pass, okay? And by that, I don't mean buy a pass if there's a mistake or something, but shouldn't they be free of being second guessed when regardless of how it's being done, they have developed a process to do it right?
Right. So you raise a very interesting issue that I think it's early because we're just seeing a trend. I'll be interested to know the exact numbers over the next few years, but it does look like really top performing companies who have good total shareholder return, that relative to their peers are performing well, they have great returns on equity, their share price holds up or exceeds expectations, are getting beaten up by a lot of the folks you just described, whether it's institutional investors, sometimes activist shareholders, oftentimes the proxy advisory firms, for things that they do differently, even though they've got this great performance. And so I don't know if I'm in the minority on this, but I feel pretty strongly about it. And that is, I think we have to be very careful to not forget the whole point of the corporate governance. Right? The whole point is to help create transparency, opportunity for companies to be forthright with shareholders, and most important, deliver good returns. So once a company's delivering good returns, I actually do think by and large, you need to ease up and let the market judge whether their experimentation, so maybe they're paying their CEO more than we might like. Maybe they have a board that has extraordinarily long tenure. Maybe they do other quirky things that just don't fit kind of the checklist that has developed over the last decade. But if they're performing well, that's a sort of experiment. And the market is the best judge. You and I can't really judge that easily. I'm not sure the proxy firms can judge as easily as they kind of make it out to be. I think we gotta let that play out. Now, it's a very different thing. If they're performing poorly and or you've got shenanigans going on, I'm in favor of the no tolerance for that. But you can have too much of a good thing. Corporate governance is not an end in itself. And that's probably bad for my business in terms of, rock center corporate governance. But I think if we lose sight of that, we run a huge risk. And the risk is a very specific thing. Everyone agrees one size does not fit all. Okay. But we are sometimes, it feels to me, particularly, for example, on pay and pay structures, we're very much headed towards a few sizes fits most, which I think is a mistake, right? Because if you go back 20 years, 60 years, 100 years, it is very clear that corporate behaviors, corporate governance structures, compensation structures, they all evolved. And they're very different now. And in that process, companies made mistakes, they failed outright, but we arrived at a system that is definitely better. And if we don't allow for some of this experimentation, I feel that we might lose some of that forward motion that gets us to the better place in another 20 years. So I think we give, within reason, a pass to companies that are quirky on corporate governance, do some things we don't like, but perform really well. Was I a little too emphatic? I feel really strongly about this. I've watched companies get beat up.
I knew I could find that raw nerve.
You did. You pressed the button. It was good.
Well, listen, I wish we had more time because there's, again, no better guest to sort of delve into these thought leadership kind of issues. But I want to thank you for joining us and taking the time. It's a pleasure to have you here at the Exchange. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member. along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton. And contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.